Hello, my name is Talip Küçükcan. It's a pleasure to host you here at the TRT World Forum and Digital Debates. Today, we are going to continue our discussion on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring and the legacy and the lessons that we learned from that process. Today, we will be talking on Algeria, one of the leading actors in North Africa. The title of our session is The Arab Spring 2.0, Past Lessons Unheeded in Algeria. I have got three excellent speakers who are all experts on Algerian politics and society. Yusuf Bander is a professor of political science from Qatar University. Thank you for joining us, Yusuf. Yusuf is, let me introduce you very briefly. He is a professor of political science at Qatar University at the Department of International Affairs. And he is a graduate of the universities of Algiers and Glasgow. And he is the author of a book titled as Human Rights and Comparative Politics. Amal, you are also welcome to join us. Amal Boubaker is co-director of the Institute for Social Sciences Research on Algeria. She has very impressive CV before me, actually. She was a visiting fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at ECFR. She was a part of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and she worked at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Brookings Doha Institute, and she was a resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. So she is very active. And Laftarguetas, he is also well known. He is a conflict transformation advisor at Cordoba Peace Institute, Geneva. He holds a PhD degree in international history from the London School of Economics and Political Science, known as LSE at the University of London. He holds a MA degree in American history, and he has many publications on Algerian politics. His forthcoming book is also interesting. It is titled as Algeria and the Cold War, International Relations and the Struggle for Autonomy. I think the book will be with us very soon. Thank you very much again for joining us. Let me begin with you, Yusuf. Some argue that the newly introduced constitutional amendments were not about the new additions, but rather about implementing these changes. Do you think that the Algerian regime is really willing to reform and respond positively to people's demands?
Well, obviously, Algeria since February 2019 has seen the eruption of the Arab Spring 2.0, following the events that took place in the Arab countries as well as Algeria. Obviously, the demonstrations have achieved certain things like the downfall of Bouteflika and so many former prime ministers, high-ranking officers of the Algerian army been jailed. There has been a talk about a new Algeria, i.e. rebuilding Algeria, that began with the elections of Mr. Tebboune as president, and Mr. Tebboune has been talking about a new Algeria. The first step in this building process has been this particular constitution. Now they're talking about new electoral law and electoral system, as well as legislative and local elections maybe in the summer. There has been a partial reshuffle of the Algerian government about a month ago, but in my view, these measures have not gone far enough. I would say that these are cosmetic measures by President Tebboune. They do not go far in defining the rules of the games. The constitution, as far as many observers are concerned, have been very disappointing. The only thing that came into it is he limited the mandates of the president to 2 mandates. This is something that a military man, General Zerwal, when he was president, he introduced a constitution in 1996, and in this constitution he limited the mandates of the president, something that Bouteflika violated in November 2008. So and the second thing is that even the referendum on this constitution So one of the lowest turnouts in Algerian elections, and not many people are happy about it. And the same thing goes for his elections. He didn't go far enough. And I would say that Tebboune has, obviously, he spent most or something like 3 months or 3.5 months in Germany, in hospital. Also, the COVID pandemic has not helped the situation overall. But I would say that pretty much many Algerians, or the majority of Algerians, have been disappointed by what happened over the last 15 months.
Well, thank you for this, I think, very useful frame, and also explaining to us the expectations and whether those expectations are being satisfied by the government. Now, let me move on to Amal. Amal, one of the amendments that stood out in the new constitution is the emphasis on the separation of powers. However, the military seems to be still at the center of power while posturing behind a civilian facet. Will these amendments lead to any substantial changes, in your opinion?
Well, indeed, in the new constitution, there's, and for the first time, has clearly put the idea that the army may be able to intervene if it realizes or if it judges that the country is endangered. And this is a very vague way to put it, and we still don't know exactly how and when the army can intervene, but it can intervene thanks to that new constitution, even in opposition to the current president. What we have to understand of Algeria is based on putting ahead, as you have said it, a military presidential, a civilian presidential facade. I think that this model is somehow experiencing some dysfunctions. As long as Bouteflika was in power, he seemed the perfect man to consolidate this model of governance. The international pressure that came at the end of the civil war. The idea was that the army will decided to step back, and that a new civilian president was now in power, and there was no pressure or demands of accountability to be directed towards the army. What happened in fourth mandate of the former President Bouteflika is that I believe this model of sharing power or sharing task of balance of power between the army and a president has been disturbed, if I can put it that way, because if you look at, of course, Tebboune has a new president, quite usual for civilian leaders and even military ones in Algeria to have their own constitution revision. It's a way to consolidate the formal aspects of their politics and to try to emphasize their supra-presidential function. And this is very much the case as well in this constitution. But at the same time, I believe made meaningless this hyper-presidential or super-presidential power over all state institutions. So indeed, now Tebboune has in his own constitution, a constitution that is giving powers to the president, very much so, over the parliament, over the parties, and so on. But at the same time, the deal is not as stable as it was under Bouteflika, under the Bouteflika era, and his position in power has also found himself faced with the willingness of the army not to have a second Bouteflika staying for 4 mandates if they decided that it's time to have a new president. So it's really much the sign of not the reinforcement of the usual model of governance of Algeria, which the army behind and the president, civilian president ahead, but much more the sign that this deal, or this deal between the army and the civilian president is not as stable as it was, or that it used to be.
Thank you very much, Amal. I think this is a very difficult issue for many Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, where the military is well established and they don't want to give up their powers. I mean, we have seen this even in Turkey as well. So we had a number of military coups or military coup attempts in Turkey. They don't want to give up their powers. So this is a problem. And we have seen in the 1990s, again in Algeria, there was a lot of discussion and debates on this too. Now, but despite the fact that the military is there, I think people are demanding change, fundamental changes. They want to have civilian governments. That's why we wanted to just see the impact of Arab Spring. There was a rise and fall of the Arab Spring, but I think at least the aspirations and the dreams that process has created, it is still on the streets. I think it is among the people. In this context, I just want to come to you, Lakhtar, about the role of the army, the political system in Algeria, why there is so much resistance not to change it. But I just want you to reply in the context of Iraq, which is now in the third year. The country has a new president, a new prime minister, a new, I think, army chief, and also amended constitution, as just mentioned by the previous two speakers. However, Algeria's political system more or less is the same. It does not change much. What is the reason behind such resistance to change in the political system of Algeria?
Thank you, Dr. I think the essence of the political system in Algeria is that the military, the psyche of the military, they believe, and truthfully they believe, I think, that they established the independent states. We have several examples around the region, and in the third world we have Indonesia as well. We have Burma. These countries that the army believes that they've brought about the states, and it falls to them to guarantee the guardianship of the durability and sustainability of the states. However, in doing so, they undermine themselves and they undermine the project, the independent, the nascent states. And we have seen this throughout the last 60 years of independence of Algeria. Every time it's the army that in a way or another shape the future of the country. The Iraq, the popular protest movement has rocked the system to the core. As Professor Bondal mentioned, we have a score of civil servants, high-ranking civil servants, high-ranking top-brass army officers. The last 3 prime ministers or so in jail or waiting trial. This is unprecedented, and this is thanks to the resilience and solidity of the popular movements that managed to overcome the perils of the decade, the civil war decade, and to come together and united behind one cause to put an end to the humiliating the Algerian society. The Algerians were served time and again, at least since for the last 6 years, where the president was incapacitated. So still the army, this is a generation brought up in the Cold War. They see meddling hands in every genuine, even if it is a national, authentic, genuine aspiration for change. They have been schooled in the Cold War psyche of superpower rivalry and covert operations, plotting, and this is one of the major reasons why they keep now and again intervene and belittling any genuine aspiration for change from the population, but from the society. I mean, the difference now is that the population or the Algerians have been mobilized for. We are entering the third year despite the coronavirus pandemic lockdown, but still the return of the protest movements have showed, at least in the last 3 weeks, that it's still resilient and solid, and you cannot put out a society that has been so mobilized with the cosmetic political initiatives that were put up to keep up appearances. It was possible in the aftermath or in the wake of the end of the conflict, the decade, to keep up appearances, to have a facade of pseudo-democracy, a nominal one, with political parties, sort of private or independent press, elections. As far as the president was delivering, and the oil revenues were coming in. The Hirak has rocked that system fundamentally to the core, and it's not easy to rebuild it again or to go back to the previous status.
Jafar, I think we all agree with you that political transition, especially in the post-colonial period, not only in Algeria but I think in all states, is very difficult. Quite a, I think, challenging one. But still, I mean, we can see that people are there despite, as you said, many difficulties, economic difficulties, despite the threat of COVID-19. People do not want to give up their demands, their political, I think, dreams. That's a significant development. But now I just want to turn to Yusuf to have his views and to pick his brain on the evaluation, 1-year evaluation of a new president. President Tebboune, as you have said, he was in power for the last 1 year. There was COVID and he spent some time outside. So, he was not very lucky in that sense. But what have been the strategies implemented by the Algerian regime to survive? Because on the one hand, we see that there is a rising demand by people on the streets, as we can see in the Hirak movement. But also the government seems to be, resisting to such changes. What are the main, I think, instruments that they use? And also, what's your evaluation of that 1 year of Tebboune, President Tebboune?
Well, I think this is a very large question. We can talk about Tebboune. He's been in power now for about 14 months. Granted that the first 3 months or so, the pandemic started, and for the last year or so, Algeria, like the rest of the world, has been suffering from it. Within that period of time, Mr. Tebboune spent about 3.5 months in Germany. But in a nutshell, I would say that his first year in power has been a complete failure, and I would say it's a write-off. Simply because his elections has been marred with lots of controversy. He basically lacks this particular legitimacy that people are accusing him of lacking. Obviously, legitimacy, in my opinion, has never been a very strong point in Algeria, because the most popular Algerian presidents, perhaps Boumediene and Boudiaf, have not been elected. So legitimacy in terms of popular elections is not necessarily an issue. A few days after he was sworn in, the strongman of the Algerian military, Ahmed Gaid Salah, who was credited of bringing Tebboune in power, died, and at that particular moment in time, Tebboune seemed to have lost the strongest possible ally in the Algerian establishment. Secondly, forming this particular government of his with something like 40 ministers have taken aback so many of close observers of Algerian affairs. That was, I would say, the weakest and the most strange governments in the country. It has not achieved anything to speak of. It has not elevated the suffering of Algerians, economic, social, and so on and so forth. If anything, political rights and civil liberties have regressed since Mr. Tebboune came to power. We saw for the first year of the Hirak, for example, there has not been any reports of police brutality towards demonstrators, but over the last 2 weeks or so, there has been lots of that, to the extent that the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva has sent a strong letter to the Algerian authorities protesting what has happened. In terms of the economy, I think that the conditions, living conditions for Algerians has worsened. The management of the pandemic has been crazy. I think since March 17th until today, almost, we are talking about 51 weeks as of now. Algerian borders have been closed. So many Algerians have not been able to see their loved ones. Some of the, I would say, draconian measures needed to be have been taken by the Algerian authorities. You need some sort of declaration or consentment by the Algerian authorities to enter the country, and until now we don't. I mean, how long will it take for Algerians to vaccinate its population? That is, the management of it has been completely shamble, and that's why the Hirak has defied the pandemic. Something that happened recently, it has the reshuffle of the Algerian government. We have about 6 or 7 ministers have been replaced, but we see that in every, as far as I can see, in every single department there has been wholesale failure, but Mr. Tebboune has failed to address that. Obviously, he suspended the National Assembly about a couple of weeks ago. He kept the Council for the Nation with Mr. Goujil as the head of this Council for the Nation. If something happens to Mr. Tebboune, Mr. Goujil, according to the Constitution, will take over. Mr. Goujil is 90 years old, and he has been supported in his quest for the presidency of the Council of the Nation by Tebboune himself. So it shows over what happened over the last 14 months. And especially when he reshuffled his government, he brought in some of the figures that were closely associated with President Bouteflika. So there has been an inertia. Things have been sort of moving, but staying in place. To quote Bob Dylan, is like, in Algeria, the times are not changing. And that what creates, that what added to the frustrations of Algerians. And if we see, for instance, the Hirak over the last 2 weeks, 2 days ago, International Women's Day, instead of celebrating that, Algerian women have gone out to call to bringing down this regime, or at least forcing the regime's hand to make the necessary deep changes to meet the aspirations of Algerian people.
Well, thank you very much. I think while talking about Hirak and this popular civil movement, let's look at this movement a little bit in a deeper way. Amal, what is your view of the performance of this movement in the last 3 years? What are the failures, achievements? And in that context, we see that in 2019 elections, they were not really able to take advantage of the shortcomings of the regime and the, let's say, fruitful environment for this movement. And in this context, what's your evaluation of past and present, and what is your view of the future of that movement, how it will evolve, and what will happen in the coming years?
Well, maybe I will give a broader picture to the people who are listening to us, and about the situation that has been inherited again from the Bouteflika years, because the Hirak is not a movement that is acting independently from the current institutional environments, institutional limits, and the difficulties that this Bicephalian civilian military models of governance in Algeria is experiencing. So in my first intervention, I said our supra-president has been built in order to avoid institutional counterpowers. That was very much in the minds of the army, the experience with the FIF, the Islamic Salvation Front party, the Islamist party who won the election between 1990 and 1992. And the idea was really to use this presidential figure to, and that's something that has also the of Bouteflika himself. This presidential figure was used to somehow replace the revolutionary legitimacy mechanisms that used to make candidates. So the idea was to have Bouteflika with the help of the secret services to appoint all the ministers, the presidents of parties, and so on, and to have this kind of if I can put it that way, that will not produce challenges and maintain the cohesion and this division of roles between the army and Bouteflika. What happened is that this model of governance has totally destroyed the official tools of formal politics. So for Tebboune, there was an urgent need to think about new negotiation schemes to replace the cooptation of opposition parties that Bouteflika used, or the idea of elections, or the revision of the constitutions, and so on. That's not what he chose to do. He really chose to somehow and use of the same people that were already active under Bouteflika's governments. Now, and even actually the opposition parties, and even the ones from the left and the Islamist ones and so on, have suffered from this restriction of what remains of official politics, or facade of official politics, has a lot of their followers and activists have actually quit the parties in protest of their leaders' decision to negotiate with the system and failing to impose their views on the Bouteflika. So that's the broader picture. Then came the Hirak, and that was a movement that was not willing to talk to the president, but willing to talk to the army, has the real power to be in Algeria. So that was the first structure and the first remodeling of this officialization of the president figure. Then there was a total rejection of the elections from the Hirak. That's something that has been discussed, especially with the announcement of Tebboune, the recent announcement of Tebboune to soon, maybe by June, organize local elections to the parties and all who, of course, have some parties related interest to defend, have said that that may be an opportunity, while the other parts, and they are actually the majority of the Hirak, say that there was no participation there was no possible participation as long as the army won't guarantee the erection of a civil state, and also some monitoring mechanism and processes to ensure that elections will be transparent. So that's really much the explanation for the Hirak not having been able to impose itself in this framework of sham elections and the semi-military, civilian politics and so on. That was a conscious and a conscious rejection of what was offered to them by the army. Now, indeed, there's a kind of fatigue within the Hirak, for sure. That's a bit paradoxal, because of course the Hirak is back, and very much so. I mean, even people who have not joined the Hirak before have joined the Hirak this time, especially in the context of a very dire economic, social, and health crisis that the government, and especially the president and even the army, has proved to be unable to manage. But at the same time, there's a kind of fatigue, people are waiting to be offered with new solutions, with a way out. So since the way out seems to be unlikely within this context of having elections, but still having the same way to function, and the power being redistributed in the same hands and the same kind of figures, what I have observed since the Hirak has emerged is really a willingness to organize itself separately, autonomously from state institutions that has been hijacked, if I can put it that way, by the regime. That means that since the very start of the Hirak, we have seen local councils within neighborhoods, within small villages and so on, that have organized themselves in order to think about a way to be politically autonomous and to organize themselves in an autonomous way. The problem is that police repression and secret services repression and the imprisonment of the emerging leaders of these initiatives has somehow slowing this movement. But I think it's something that we will see more and more, especially as it seems that the president and even the army has no way out to offer to the population outside of the same repeating scenario of having elections, having a new president, and business as usual. So that's how we can explain the difficulties of the Hirak to impose itself, at least in formal politics.
Well, I think that's a very useful analysis of the past and also the present. You did not mention one thing that I'll ask Lakhtar, that is about the nature of the popular movement, because I think Amal has very successfully explained structural difficulties, but on the other hand, I think no opposition, no popular movement is a one-voice movement. I mean, there is no homogeneous movement, ideologically speaking, and I think Hirak is similar to that. And to what extent, Lakhtar, do you think that the government has created frictions among the Hirak, let's say, groups, so that they are not very influential, and what they did for that? And maybe you can also comment on the future, whether they will be a united voice or the frictions will increase in the Hirak movement.
Definitely, the regime has sought to, by a combination of smear campaigns, plotting, to undermine the Hirak, but the regime itself has been committing blunder after blunder that kept refueling and re-energizing the protest movement, either by giving in too short, too late, reshuffling previous figures of the Bouteflika era, as Professor Bondal has mentioned, attempting to open, when they did submit to one of the calls of the regime of the Hirak to open a dialogue with the Hirak, they sought to co-opt some figures and go talk to the non-formal opposition that itself have kept the Bouteflika regime afloat. We know that it weighs nothing, the formal opposition, but in the view of in the eyes of the West, keeping up appearances coalitions in the formal opposition parties, which is plural. You have your Islamists there, you have your nationalists in it, you have your leftists. It's this series of blunders that the Iraq has, the regime, sorry, has committed that kept refueling and energizing the Iraq. Coming back to the Iraq movement, of course, it's a leaderless movement, popular one. Horizontal organization, the different constituencies. You have your leftists in it, you have your secularists, you have conservatives, not to say Islamists, you have your nationalists, and you have those who are in it. They're fed up with the dire economic situation. But also, we shouldn't forget that the base of this movement is a generation that has been schooled up in Arab Spring 1. They have been brought up, those who are in their 20s, 30s now, who are fueling the weekly protests, the students. These are the ones who witnessed the Arab Spring Act 1 when they were finishing their high secondary school education. These are the ones who have done their graduate studies when the Arab Spring Act 1 was running, and now they are out in the streets jobless. These are postgraduates who have finished 10 years ago and are now still 5-7 years later medical doctors jobless or in precarious jobs. It's this combination of different forces in society that is fueling the protest movement, and with the experience of the decade, the bloody decade, the chaotic 20-year rule of Bouteflika, where I mean astronomical revenues have been squandered. I mean, without delivering the latest. And this is a generation that is interconnected internet, and they look just onto the east and see Tunisia with the modest revenues, tourism, or look to Turkey, or look, and they compare and they said, how come this, I mean, nightmare, disastrous, chaotic management of the affairs of the states continue? And then they come to the conclusion that the single continuous element that is coherent in all this system is the regime, is the army, and the guardianship or the tutelage that the army have granted themselves in running the affairs of the states. And then they come to the conclusion that's the slogan is that the main slogan of the protest movement: we want a civilian state, not a military one. And so they've identified the issue, and precisely to the heart of the issue, that there needs to be a reform there. The rest is noise. The rest is cosmetics, and it would be difficult to rebuild the system. Yes, there are frictions within the movements, and it's the regime has labor to exacerbate them, pitting conservatives to secularists or so-called ethnicities. Yet the blenders kept the movement moving, and also it's this generational difference one. Had they started with Islamists just right after Bouteflika toppled and to weaken the movement, had they started with the conservative versus secularists, they might have to some time, and I'm not convinced that to undermine the movements. But they did a blender to start with something that this new generation, these 20s, 30s, they no longer see a problem if you are Amazigh and you could be still Amazigh and Algerian, and you could be still, I mean, it was a different era, and they were using the playbook of former gone time. And then when they try to catch up, right now they are using the conservative secularists card. And I believe it will backfire, because if the noise on the social media, but you go down to the streets, you see a different picture. And the other element that is limiting the impact of these frictions or the campaigns of the regime to divide the movement is that it isn't a formal opposition, formal political parties that were playing the political game, but also had the foot on the opposition that is the backbone of the movement. They are completely the formal opposition, with the exception maybe of RCD, that is in the Islamists. That if you were planning to pit Islamists to secularists in this Hirak movement, you have the official Islamists in Algeria, the MSP party. Just 2 weeks before the movement on national private TV, they were saying that the people will not come out. And they were saying that it's perilous and then disastrous if the people come out. And yet Algerians came out into the port, in the streets on the 22nd. So the absence of that dominant formal political movement in the Hirak is in fact the strength why this protest movement is ongoing. As any movement, there are discussions within it, but so far the regime has fired, and it's my conviction that the playing on the secularist Islamist code will backfire and will not deliver for the regime.
Well, thanks for these, I think, important details that really enables us to better understand the Hirak movement. As Lakhdar, I think, described, this generation is called Generation Z. So it is their approach to politics, their methods that they use, and their demands, and the articulation and rhetoric, political rhetoric, is fairly different. And now I just want to come to Yusuf again on the articulation of the movement. I think Lakhdar has very clearly said that there are many ideological currents in the movement, but there's a strong ground. The objective is the same, and there is a very, I think, there's almost a consensus that there should be some change. But despite such, I think, strengths, as far as we can see, Hirak created a momentum, this is true, but failed to, I think, realize the changes, real changes. What are the reasons behind it? And you can also maybe add a few things to what Amal and Lakhdar said about the nature of the movement.
Well, thank you. And I think that both my colleagues, Amal and Lakhdar, have done an excellent job in describing what happened and what is happening. So I think that they draw a fantastic picture. I can add just a few things. The protests in Algeria has been a hobby over the last 20 years or so. And but when we look at the protests before, it has been geographically localized in certain parts of the country, or it has been localized by certain groups, like, say, teachers, professors, doctors, and so on and so forth. The difference with the Hirak is it is Algerian. So people see themselves as Algerian first. There are obviously so many different currents, but these currents have been put aside for the duration of the Hirak. They see themselves as Algerians. They see that the problems with Algeria is this particular military-backed government. Like Lakhdar said, they Bouteflika regime squandered billions and billions of dollars, enough to rebuild Iraq and Syria together. The second thing, I think there is a generation gap. The ruling elite in Algeria is still living in the 60s with the typewriter. The new guys at the moment, the Hirakis, are using their iPhone, they're using their Samsung, they're using Twitter, they're using so many million technology in order to do that. The second thing is that the Algerian regime lately is trying to revert to the old practices where it demonized opposition. Before, they used to say basically the Berbers, they're looking for autonomy and so on and so forth. The Islamists are going to establish an Islamic Republic or Islamic state, and where women will be relegated to the background and so on and so forth. But if we look at what happened recently, and I have three particular examples to show. We have Ben Grina, basically an Islamist, and he was a candidate for the presidential elections, attacking what he called the Dashra, the neighborhood. This is a colloquial term in Algeria used to refer to the Amazigh or to the Berbers in Algeria. In other words, we are seeing the regime through Ben Grina attacking the Berbers. Louisa Hannoun, who was in jail apparently for complotting against the country with the Said Bouteflika and the current and former heads of the Algerian security services, Tartag and Toufiq Madian. She has been accusing the Islamists. So we have here the two angles, discrediting the Islamists on the one hand using Louisa Hannoun, and discrediting the Berbers using Ben Grina. Also, a senator, the Ben Zaim, came out and he was telling Algerians that, for instance, Assoul, who was a member of the appointed parliament in transition from 1994 to 1997, saying that she was a member of this particular parliament, between inverted commas, and she's earning something like 40 million centimes. This is the Algerian currency, a month, retirement for life, where we have the minimum guaranteed wage in Algeria is 2 million. Obviously, this is very well known fact. All Algerians knew, or most Algerians knew about it. Assoul, regardless of whatever she did before, she is perceived as a secularist and has been super active in the Hirak, in Algiers, and in different cities throughout the country. The timing here is very important, and I believe that Ben Zaim's comments about this particular issue are not necessarily innocent. I can see three angles from which we attack the Hirak and try to divide it.
Well, thank you very much. I think now we have a complete picture and portrayal of Hirak and the difficulties and also the chances that they have. Now let me move on to Amal about the early election issues. You know, sometimes when there are crises and challenges, early elections seems to be, sometimes miracle. However, we see that Algeria and many countries in the region have deeply rooted problems. Do you think that early election in Algeria will solve the problems? Or what will be the impact of any early election in Algeria, given the economic problems, coronavirus, and the resistance of the military, etc.?
No, I think that any new president or even institutional framework innate the official political landscapes, and that's something that Tebboune is trying to do, that we create new parties from the top and so on. I mean, this process will lack credibility anyway, as long as it remains unable to address the problematic political control of the security forces of the country. And the risk is that as long as the army is waiting for this system to be accepted, or for Tebboune to found a miracle way to have a proper a government that functions properly, the more the Hirak is bringing the idea and the debates of the debate on the military nature of the power in Algeria on the political scene. I would like to maybe also add, I mean, I'm going to answer your question, but to add on what my colleagues have said about the nature of the Hirak, there are two ways to understand politics in Algeria, if I may, and to understand the political nature of the Hirak and the political nature of the crisis and the potential way out of the crisis. First, as I said, the way the Hirak is deeply linked.
It seems that we have lost Amal. Hopefully she will join us very soon. At least I cannot hear. I guess Yusuf and Lakhtar cannot hear either. Maybe we can communicate with her. And now let's move on to Lakhtar. I just would like to ask you a similar question that I asked to Yusuf, the performance of the government in 1 year, especially the current president. Given the now Amal is back. Okay, Amal.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I can resume what I was saying. So we have had for the past 20 years a lot of riots in the countries. We have had riots against the security apparatus of the power, like families of the disappeared, people who are asking for some transparency for what has occurred in the 90s and so on. This is linked to the international security functioning of the regime. We have had protests that are challenging the entire nature of the I'm sorry. To have my colleague answer, and I will come back to you.
Okay. All right.
I think if I'd like to pick up on follow up on
please
on what Amal was saying is as I said before, it's not possible to rebuild the facade following such deep mobilization of the society. First, because of the strength of the protest movements and the peaceful nature of the movement, and any attempt to put it down by brute force, it will backfire, and it will generate the international condemnation to which Professor Bondal mentioned at the beginning, the latest statement by the UN Human Rights Council. The second element is that this system that they are trying to rebuild is being rebuilt by the same instruments, flawed and rigged instruments of the Bouteflika regime, and you cannot sell it down. I mean, you have a constitution that has been discussed and passed by the government, the parliament of Bouteflika in his last term. You have elections that have been organized by the ministers of Bouteflika and by the local councils that were deeply flawed, also elected in the last term of Bouteflika before his ousting by the military and the protest movement pressure. These two instruments, you have figures of the regime are from the past. You cannot rebuild it with the same figures. It's difficult, a hard sell for the population. The other element is that time and again the Hirak movement has been calling for. I mean, they have not been calling for something extraordinary. They have been calling for an inclusive dialogue, a national dialogue to which the army would be part, a national conference to sort out things and agree a transition. If we take a step back to the beginning, just right after Bouteflika was ousted, there were two competing narratives, if you'd like. There was one narrative saying that the Hirak calling for a national conference for inclusive dialogue, agree a transition period, and then we'll at the Tunisian model, and we will move on. And there was the regimes or the army's narrative, which was the transition is the transition period is a danger. It might lead us to the Libyan, Yemeni, or other scenarios. So this competing. But look now, 2 years later, or 3 years later, or 2 years later, had we gone through a short transition, would have sorted out, and we would have gained all this time that is now we are like back to square one. Bouteflika was quasi absent during his last year. Tebboune was also. We have now dissolved government, dissolved the lower house of the assembly, and the government in disarray, and the total discreditation of the political game in Algeria.
Lahtar, thank you very much. We have got a few minutes to go. I think we should give floor to Amal again for her maybe last remarks, huh? Then I'll move on to Yusuf for your last observations. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption. No, what I was going to say maybe briefly in a nutshell is that the fact that the regime has not allowed public debate on the state of civil liberties, on discussing transitional scenarios within the internal differences and ideological differences of the Hirak, is now having an effect of, let's say, battle of narratives, as Lahtar was mentioning it within the Hirak, which is, but there's also, it's true that there's a generational rift, but there's also maybe much more or a rupture between an elitist process of considering politics has linked to parties, to elections, to compromises and negotiations with Tebboune and with the secret services, and a very grounded way to do politics from the majority of the population, which actually for the past 20 years and even more have not been allowed to act. How I have doubts that there could be, I mean, these differences are somehow irreconcilable. And again, I think we're going to have this parallel track of the Hirak thinking about its own transition in a very tumultuous way, and with exposing the internal ideological or simply social status differences, and the army with the figure of the president on the other side trying to go on with this this process of trying to organize presidential elections that are no meaningless, or local and legislative elections that has actually no competition. So it's going to be complicated, and I think it's going to take long.
Yusuf. Yusuf, there is a tendency in some countries which do not want to change the system to usually securitize the problems. Now there is a coronavirus problem, and some countries, some leaders might, or some regimes might securitize this, and in order to delay or reject the social and political changes, they just try to deal with this issue. What is the likelihood of securitization of such crisis in Algeria to, let's say, turn a blind eye to social and political demands?
Well, I think they have been trying to do that for the last year or so. I think that the pandemic has been God's gift to the Algerian new ruling elite, new between inverted commas elite, and they would continue, or they would try to continue to do that. Obviously, what happened over the last week or so, 2 weeks, has taken the Algerian authorities by surprise. They did not expect people to come out defying the so-called pandemic. I think that the authorities have lost the bet. the people in Algeria are they have achieved a few things. I mean, nobody, if you told Algerians that, for instance, Bouteflika will not be in power and so many of his officials in jail, they would think that you're crazy. So they have achieved certain things. The Hirak still believes that they can achieve a lot of things. Now, especially with the intervention of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is a very strong signal, to the Algerian authorities, but also to the Iraqis. The Algerian authorities want to go for elections because it's okay. I mean, Western governments, international, regional organizations can turn a blind eye to rigged elections, but they would not do that in terms of violations for human rights.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lakhtar Gettas, Professor Yusuf Bandel, and Amal Boubaker. Thank you very much for joining to Digital Debates by TRT World Forum. And I think we have discussed a lot of issues with regard to Arab Spring and its impact on Algeria. And we will, of course, follow Algeria very closely. From TRT World Digital Debates, goodbye to everyone and have a nice time. Goodbye to all.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.